The man who would one day challenge a Gandhi for the soul of India is standing alone in a narrow colonial corridor, holding a single sheet of paper that can destroy his entire life. It is the early 1930s. The sun over Bombay is already brutal, turning the whitewashed walls of the Secretariat into a blinding mirror. Inside, the air smells of sweat, ink, and fear. At the far end of the corridor waits a heavy teak door, the office of the British collector. Behind that door sits the empire. Promotions, pension, power, or humiliation. In Morarji Desai's hand is his resignation. If he walks through that door and puts this paper on the table, he throws away everything he has clawed his way up to from a village schoolroom in Gujarat. If he doesn't, he must accept what he considers an unforgivable insult, a stain on his integrity, a quiet surrender to injustice. Outside, the clock in the Secretariat Tower ticks in harsh metallic snaps. Every second he hesitates, clerks shuffle past, avoiding his eyes. Some of them are Indian like him, wearing neatly pressed shirts and English ties. Men who have decided that comfort under foreign rule is better than sacrifice for a future no one can yet see. They envy his rank. They fear his choice. Somewhere in India, a young Jawaharlal Nehru is addressing crowds. Somewhere, Mohandas Gandhi is sharpening the idea of non-cooperation. Somewhere, a little girl named Indira is watching her father and learning the grammar of power. But here, in this corridor, it all narrows down to one man, one page, one decision. To understand how Morarji Desai ends up here, how a village boy becomes a rigid, unbending figure staring down an empire, we have to go back to the beginning, long before the Prime Minister's chair, long before the bitter wars inside the Congress Party, long before his name would be whispered with hatred by some and grudging respect by others. Back to a dusty village on the edge of empire. He was born in 1896 on a rare day that appears on calendars only once in 4 years, 29th of February in Badeli, a small village in what is now Gujarat. British India was at its confident height. The Union Jack flew over continents. In Badeli, though, power looked different. It was a schoolteacher with tired eyes, walking miles each day with a stack of tattered books under his arm. That schoolteacher was Anantrai Desai, Morarji's father. Anantrai was not rich, not powerful, but in a land where most people could not sign their own names, he held the key to a different kind of future. He drilled into his son a simple, hard philosophy. Discipline is everything. Truth is not an idea to admire. It is a punishment you accept, even when it hurts you. This is not the tender, sentimental childhood of legends. The Desai home was strict. Mistakes were not gently corrected. They were carved out of you. The young Morarji grew up in an atmosphere where lateness was a sin and self-indulgence almost criminal. While other children played, he copied lines, memorized lessons, and watched his father's back bend lower each year over a blackboard that barely paid the bills. In the evenings, under an oil lamp that smoked more than it shone, he heard whispers about a distant power that was both admired and resented. The Sarkar, the government, was a magical machine. It could grant jobs, land, titles. It could also crush a village with a single letter. British officials were spoken of with fear and envy. Educated Indians who worked for them, in the railways, in the courts, in the revenue offices, were treated like minor gods when they came home on leave. Young Morarji watched all this silent, absorbing. There is a moment in many lives when ambition is born not as a dream, but as a refusal. I will not live like this. For Morarji, it was the sight of his father counting coins late at night, calculating how to pay fees, buy food, and maintain a tiny shred of dignity in a system that rewarded sycophancy more than merit. If the British Raj was a ladder, he would learn to climb it. Better, he would master it. By the time he left for higher studies in Bombay, he had already developed 2 traits that would define him for the rest of his life. An almost military sense of order and a dangerous, icy certainty that he was right. Bombay at the turn of the century was a shock. The noise, the smell of the docks, the roar of trams and carriages, white faces striding past with the confidence of owners, Indian, elites trading in English as if it were their mother tongue. In this storm of smells and languages, the young man from Badeli moved with tight-lipped focus. He studied at Wilson College, one of the city's most prestigious institutions. Around him, politics was beginning to stir. Students argued in canteens about Swaraj, self-rule. Voices were rising against the empire, some calm and reasoned, others hot with anger. But while many young men were being swept away by slogans, Morarji's mind worked along a colder line. If we want to change this system, and we must first understand it from the inside. So when he got a chance to join the civil service of the Bombay presidency as a subordinate officer, he took it. There is a certain kind of betrayal that revolutionaries never forgive. The sight of one of their own in the uniform of the oppressor. For many nationalists in Bombay, that's what men like Morarji seem to be. Collaborators, brown faces enforcing white law. For Morarji himself, however, the uniform was not a chain. It was a test of character. As a young deputy in the Revenue Administration, he enforced rules with a brutality that shocked even his colleagues. Corrupt Patels and middlemen learned quickly that there were no shortcuts with this tall, lean officer with sharp, watchful eyes. If the regulation said a field must be measured, it was measured. If an account was short by a single rupee, someone answered for it. He was feared. He was also quietly respected. Yet the more he mastered the machinery of the Raj, the more a crack began to open inside him. Traveling through villages, he saw the real cost of the laws he applied so perfectly. Peasants bent double with debt, children with swollen bellies, entire communities living and dying under a tax regime crafted in London, not in the soil of Gujarat. In dusty inspection bungalows with the night sounds of insects and far-off drums, he wrestled with a question he never voiced aloud. Can you serve justice in an unjust system? The nationalist movement was no longer a distant echo. Gandhi had returned from South Africa. Non-cooperation, the charkha, the salt tax. These were not abstractions. They were being discussed in every bazaar he passed through. While he checked land records by day, by night he sometimes heard spinning wheels whirring in the dark, quiet acts of defiance under his very nose. He watched, analyzed, but did not yet join. To some of his early colleagues, this looked like cowardice. To himself, it was discipline. If he was going to choose a side, he would do it on his own terms, not under the pressure of slogans yelled in a street. But history does not like fence-sitters for long. The crisis came, as such crises often do, in a brutal, messy way, not in a grand national moment, but in a local riot whose details would vanish from history books, leaving only a scar on one man's career. There were communal tensions in one of the districts under his administrative reach. The rumors spread faster than telegrams. A desecrated shrine, an insult, a revenge attack. Before the file had even landed on his table, people were bleeding in the streets. As deputy in charge, he had to respond. He did what he always did. He imposed order, fast and hard. Curfews, arrests, lathis on backs. The violence stopped, but the anger did not. Some claimed he had been too harsh on one community, too lenient on another. Petitions began to travel upwards through the bureaucracy. The British superiors, suspicious of every Indian officer's loyalties, demanded explanations. For the first time, his own rigid sense of fairness found itself on trial. He was summoned, questioned, watched. The same cold administrative machine he had served now turned its magnifying glass on him. Did he show partiality? Was he secretly sympathetic to nationalists? Why had he not used even harsher force? In private, some older Indian officials advised him with the weary realism of men who had learned how to survive. Let it go. Accept the transfer. A black mark in your file is not the end of the world. Don't fight the Sarkar. But the boy from Bareilly had grown into a man for whom honor was not a decorative word. To live with an official rebuke for unfairness was, for him, like admitting to a lie he hadn't told. The British offered him exactly that, bureaucratic survival at the price of conscience. A quiet demotion, a sideways posting, a lifetime of knowing that somewhere in a locked file the Empire had written a slur against his character. This is how we find him again in that corridor in Bombay, years later, still young but with lines already starting at the corners of his eyes, holding his resignation in a hand that refuses to tremble. He is not yet the man who will face Indira Gandhi across Parliament. He is not yet the Prime Minister who will be mocked for his old-fashioned morals and iron self-control. He is just a civil servant from a small village, staring down a choice that will either make his life meaningless or unimaginably dangerous. Stay, and he keeps his salary, his status, his path to a secure retirement, and lives with what he sees as a stain on his soul. Leave, and he steps into a storm where the British are still jailing people for speaking too loudly about freedom, where men lose years of their lives to dark cells in Ahmednagar and Yerwada, where the Congress itself is a boiling pot of egos, factions, and rivalries. He knows, too, that he is no Nehru, no orator with poetry on his tongue. In the rough and tumble of nationalist politics, men like him, stern, austere, a little humorless, are easy to overlook. There will be rivals everywhere. More charismatic speakers, more flexible tacticians, people willing to bend where he cannot. And yet the clock ticks. The door waits. He walks. Each step down that corridor away from safety and toward uncertainty is powered not by romantic nationalism but by something colder and, in its own way, far more dangerous, an obsession with principle. If the system is unjust, he will not be part of it. If truth has a price, he will pay it himself. When he finally hands in the resignation, the British superior looks at him with a mix of irritation and confusion. Indians did not usually quit these jobs. They clung to them, fought for them, schemed for them. This quiet, rigid man walking away from a career, not toward another offer, but straight into the arms of the opposition, it made no sense in the logic of empire. Yet that is exactly what he does. In the days that follow, the comfortable circles of the civil service close behind him without a ripple. The Raj forgets him with astonishing speed. The machine has many other cogs. But in shabby Congress offices, in homes where freedom is planned over cups of thin tea and borrowed chairs, a new figure begins to appear. Morarji Desai, former officer, now full-time worker for the nationalist cause. This is not a triumphant cinematic arrival. There is no band waiting, no roaring crowd. His first tasks are not heroic speeches, but the grim, invisible work that movements run on, organizing committees, checking accounts, drafting resolutions, traveling from town to town, building up the Congress structure. He accepts it without complaint. Discipline is discipline, whether in the service of the crown or the struggle against it. But he brings with him something else from his years in government, a deep distrust of chaos. In a party full of fiery socialists and romantic idealists, he is a hard edge. He worries about finances, about law and order, about how mass agitations can turn into mobs. This immediately puts him on a quiet collision course with a whole generation of younger, more radical nationalists who want faster or sharper confrontation. The rivalry that will later explode between him and Indira Gandhi has its roots here in this fundamental tension, order versus passion, a rulebook versus impulse, gradual reform versus sweeping change. In committee rooms and provincial meetings, he begins to clash, politely at first, then more sharply, with colleagues who think he is too conservative, too cautious, too attached to discipline when the country is on fire. Yet for Gandhi and other senior leaders, that very strictness has its uses. As the freedom struggle spreads, as protests flare and British jails fill up, the movement also needs people who can keep its skeleton intact. Men who will still be at the office at midnight, checking lists. Men who will refuse to fudge accounts even when the money comes in from anonymous donors. Men who are not afraid to say no when everyone else is swept away in a tide of slogans. Bit by bit, the boy from Bareilly, the officer who walked away from security, becomes one of those men. What he does not yet know as he travels by slow trains through a country in revolt is that every day he spends within the Congress builds not just his reputation but his future enemies. For in a movement this large, every strict decision creates resentment, every principled refusal creates a rival, and somewhere ahead of him, on a path neither of them can yet see, walks a woman who will one day turn from colleague to competitor, from fellow Congress worker to the embodiment of everything he believes must be challenged. For now, though, the British flag still flies. The war in Europe approaches. The chants of "Quit India" are not yet echoing through the streets. Morarji Desai is just beginning to learn that the struggle for freedom is not only against foreign rulers, but against the weaknesses, ambitions, and illusions of his own countrymen, and against something even harder to conquer, the unyielding logic of time itself. Because in a few short years, the empire will crack. Independence will arrive, violent and unfinished. And when that moment comes, men like him will have only a narrow, ruthless window to shape what comes after. The clock that once ticked in a Bombay corridor has not stopped. It has only grown louder. The clock that once ticked in a Bombay corridor is now echoing in a prison fort. An old man in a plain khadi kurta lies awake on a hard cot in Ahmednagar Fort. It is 1975. Outside, barbed wire glints under floodlights. Inside, the air smells of damp stone and disinfectant. The man has been stripped of his watch, his files, his telephone, his newspapers. For the first time in half a century, he has no meetings to chair, no budget to balance, no orders to sign. His name is Morarji Desai. For decades, he has been the man waiting in the wings, the disciplined lieutenant, the careful administrator. Twice he has watched the job he believes he was born for, Prime Minister of India, slip from his fingers at the last possible minute. Now at 79, he is in jail under the orders of the woman who took that job from him, Indira Gandhi. A guard's boots scrape along the corridor. Somewhere a radio turned low leaks out propaganda about internal security and national discipline. Outside these walls, newspapers are being censored, phones tapped, opponents dragged from their beds at midnight. Inside, he stares at the ceiling and counts the seconds. He does the calculation in his head with the same cold precision he once used to audit budgets. If I stay here 5 years, I will walk out at 84. I will never again hold power. I will die as the man who almost became prime minister. The deadline is not written on any wall, but it is real. The ticking of his own body. His enemy is not only Indira, not only her emergency, it is time itself. To understand how a boy from Delhi ended up here, poised between political extinction and the most improbable comeback in Indian history, we have to rewind back through the years when he seemed always close to power but never quite allowed to touch it. When India first tasted elected power in 1937 under limited provincial autonomy, Morarji Desai was no longer the uncertain civil servant of that Bombay corridor. He had become a hard, reliable organizer of the Congress in Gujarat. With years of prison and protest behind him, he had joined the civil disobedience movement, spent time in jail for defying salt laws and British ordinances, and risen steadily through the party machinery. When the Congress swept the polls in the Bombay presidency, the leadership needed someone to handle the most thankless job in government, home and revenue. They turned to the rigid ex-officer who knew the machine from both sides. As Home Minister in the first Congress government of Bombay, Morarji stepped into an office that still smelled of colonial power. Heavy wooden desks, steel filing cabinets, police reports stamped "secret" in red. Only this time, the man signing the orders was not a white collector, but an Indian nationalist who had once enforced these laws and then turned against them. Power revealed a new edge in him. He ran the Home Department like a barracks. Files were cleared on time. Officers were punished for sloppiness. Corruption was hunted with the same severity he had used against crooked Patels years before. To many ordinary citizens, this was a strange new experience. A government that actually read its own rules and insisted others do the same. But discipline is a blade that can cut both ways. When World War II broke out and the British dragged India into it without consultation, the Congress ministries resigned in protest. Morarji returned to the streets and eventually the prisons. During the Quit India movement of 1942, he was locked up for the longest continuous stretch of his life. The memory of those years, the cold floors, the endless debates in jail yards, the letters written in tiny script on smuggled paper, would later clash violently with his image in the 1970s, when young radicals would accuse him of being an authoritarian old man who did not understand protest. He knew protest. He had worn its bruises on his own skin. Independence, when it finally came in 1947, was not a clean, cinematic dawn. It was a bloody, chaotic birth. Partition tore the country open. Refugee trains rolled into Bombay, carrying bodies and broken families. In this storm, the new Indian state needed men who would not flinch from hard decisions. Again, the leadership turned to him. He became Home and Revenue Minister in the newly formed Bombay state. The British had gone, but the structure they left behind, police, courts, bureaucracy, remained. Someone had to control it, reform it, and, when necessary, unleash it. He did not blink. He cracked down on smuggling in the port, forced honesty into procurement after years of war profiteering, and demanded a level of integrity from his officers that many resented and secretly admired. The image of Morarji Desai as the stern guardian of law and order was now fixed in the public mind. Yet even as the tricolor flew over government buildings, a new kind of struggle began, one he could not resolve with lothus and circulars. The struggle of democracy's demands against his own rigid sense of order. Nowhere did this clash become more brutal than in the question of language and states. The old Bombay state was a vast, awkward creature, covering what is now Maharashtra and Gujarat, with populations speaking different languages, dreaming different dreams. A powerful movement grew in Bombay city, demanding a separate Marathi-speaking state, Samyukta Maharashtra, with Bombay as its capital. For many fiery activists and ordinary workers, this was a question of identity and justice. For Morarji Desai, then Chief Minister of Bombay after the first general elections of 1952, it was a threat to stability and economic unity. He opposed the division fiercely. The protests that followed were not calm debates in seminar halls. They were marches in the streets, strikes, clashes with the police. On 24 November 1955, demonstrators defied prohibitory orders. Police opened fire. Blood flowed on the city's asphalt. In countless homes, people read the headlines and whispered, "Desai gave the orders." For some, he was now the villain of their story, the man who shot down their dream. For others, he was the only one with the courage to stand against the rising tide of parochialism. But politics does not reward nuance. It remembers only the blood. The agitation grew. The pressure from within the Congress mounted. In 1956, as the map of India was redrawn along linguistic lines, Bombay state was split. Gujarat and Maharashtra were carved out. The movement had won. The chief minister who had opposed it, who had stubbornly insisted that Bombay must not be divided, was left with a facts-on-the-ground defeat. Morarji resigned. It was his second major break with power, another door walked away from on principle. But this time, the empire he had resisted was not British. It was public opinion in a democracy he had helped create. If the story ended there, he would have been a footnote, a strict provincial administrator overtaken by history. Instead, New Delhi called. Jawaharlal Nehru, the towering prime minister with his rose and his rhetoric, was also a pragmatist. He knew that the new nation needed not just dreamers, but hard men with experience in managing complex administrations. Morarji Desai was invited to the center, first as Minister for Commerce and Industry, then as Finance Minister. The ex-schoolteacher's son from Delhi now held the keys to India's treasury. The office of Finance Minister is not a place of applause. It is a room of sleepless nights, of inflation charts, of begging foreign creditors without appearing to beg, of telling a poor country that it cannot have everything at once. Morarji brought to it his trademark austerity. He discouraged wasteful spending, scolded colleagues for unnecessary foreign trips, and presented budgets that were as straight-backed as his posture. He distrusted deficit financing, mistrusted easy promises, and believed with absolute conviction that a nation, like a household, should live within its means. This made him once again both respected and hated. To Nehru's left-leaning advisers and the rising socialist voices in the Congress, he was too conservative, too cautious, too wedded, too old-fashioned ideas of thrift in a country that needed bold investment. To the business elite, he was unpredictable, incorruptible, yes, but also unwilling to bend in their favor. Yet in cabinet meetings, his voice could not be ignored. He was not dazzled by Nehru's eloquence, nor frightened by his authority. In a room full of men who often deferred to the prime minister, Morarji would say, calmly and infuriatingly, "I do not agree." In those clashes, another, more subtle conflict was taking shape. Not between him and Nehru, who shared a basic loyalty despite differences, but between him and the future. Because while he argued about rupee devaluations and taxation, a new generation was watching from the sidelines. Among them was a woman who had grown up in the shadow of Nehru's desk, who had smuggled messages for the freedom movement as a girl, who knew the sound of crowds like other people knew lullabies. Her name, written in bureaucratic files then as an unthreatening detail, would one day become the axis of his life, Indira Gandhi. When Nehru died in 1964, India felt orphaned. The question that had been whispered for years, after Nehru, who, suddenly became urgent, dangerous, real. In that moment, the man who seemed, on paper, most qualified to step in was Morarji Desai. He had been chief minister of a major state, commerce minister, finance minister. He had a reputation for honesty and firmness. He was, crucially, not tainted by corruption or scandal. In many democracies, that CV would have carried him straight into the top job. But power in India was never only about resumes. It was about chemistry, fears, secret promises, and the ghosts of the freedom struggle. Inside the Congress, a group of powerful regional bosses, the syndicate, feared that Morarji, once in the prime minister's chair, would be impossible to control. They wanted someone more malleable, more consensus-seeking, less likely to say no and walk away. They turned to Lal Bahadur Shastri, gentle, respected, but without Morarji's sharp elbows. Morarji pushed for a formal election within the party, Believing that his support among workers and many MPs would carry him, the very demand unnerved the old guard. In the end, faced with the danger of a public split in the party he had served since his youth, he stepped back. Shastri became prime minister. For the second time, he had come close to the summit and turned aside rather than tear the party in half. Discipline again over personal ambition, principle again over the immediate prize. He comforted himself with a simple thought: there will be other chances. Then fate twisted the knife. Shastri died suddenly in 1966 in Tashkent, hours after signing a peace agreement with Pakistan. Once more the question, who now? Exploded through the corridors of power. This time Morarji was certain. Twice passed over would be an insult he could not accept. He mobilized his supporters. The syndicate, still wary of his uncompromising nature, looked elsewhere. From the shadows of Nehru's memory, they pulled forward a figure they thought they could manage: Indira Gandhi, Nehru's only daughter, and then serving as information and broadcasting minister. To many in the syndicate, she was Gungi Gudia, a dumb doll, a sentimental choice who would tug at public affection for Nehru while doing what she was told. They misread her as badly as they had read him. Inside the Congress Parliamentary Party, a bitter contest unfolded. Morarji Desai versus Indira Gandhi, order versus charm. The man of iron routines versus the woman of carefully controlled emotion. Ballots were cast. When they were counted, Indira had 355 votes. Morarji had 169. He had not merely lost. He had lost to someone he saw as inexperienced, impulsive, dangerously willing to promise what a poor country could not afford. The rivalry that had been slowly fermenting now curdled into something harder. At first, he swallowed it. He joined her government as finance minister and later deputy prime minister. The compromise looked neat on paper, the elder statesman providing stability, the younger leader fronting a modern progressive India. But their differences were fundamental. She believed in a more aggressive state role in the economy, in using populist measures, bank nationalization, abolition of privy, purses to appeal directly to the poor and undercut older elites. He believed in gradualism, fiscal discipline, and respect for institutional processes. To her circle, he looked like a relic. To him, she was playing with fire. Their final break came in 1969 over the nationalization of major banks and the choice of the Congress candidate for the presidency. When she defied the syndicate and backed an independent-minded candidate, he sided with the party organization against her. She, in turn, used that rebellion to split the Congress itself. In the great schism that followed, letters and numbers replaced old loyalties. Her faction became Congress, R, for requisitionists. His became Congress, O, for organization. She had the mass of MPs, the charisma, and the keys to the state machinery. He had seniority, a cleaner image, and a dwindling pool of loyalists. The 1971 general election settled the argument brutally. Indira Gandhi fought under the slogan, Garibi Hatao, remove poverty, and wrapped herself in the triumph of the Bangladesh War. Her faction swept the polls. His Congress, O, was crushed. In that moment, most of the political class wrote his obituary. The old disciplinarian, it seemed, was finished, outgunned, outmaneuvered, out of time. He was in his mid-70s. In a country where the median age was under 20, he looked like a grandfather lecturing a restless crowd. The woman he opposed sat in the prime minister's chair with a mandate powerful enough to tempt anyone to believe they were the nation itself. Then India's democracy began to choke. By 1974, the sheen of Indira's victory had faded. Inflation raged, corruption scandals grew. In Bihar, then Gujarat, students and workers poured into the streets. A frail, saintly figure, Jayaprakash Narayan, JP, called for total revolution, a peaceful uprising against misrule. Once again, Morarji Desai found himself on the side of protest, this time not against the British, but against a government shaped by his own party's past. He joined JP's movement, spoke at rallies, lent to the agitation his image of probity and administrative weight. The crowds were not always patient with his sermons on discipline and morality. They wanted fire, not accountancy. But they listened because they sensed he was one of the few leaders whose life had actually matched his words. The real earthquake, though, hit in a courtroom, not a rally. In June 1975, the Allahabad High Court declared Indira Gandhi guilty of electoral malpractice and invalidated her 1971 election. It was a technical case about campaign abuses and law. But in its impact, it was dynamite. Faced with the prospect of losing her seat, her office, perhaps even her liberty, she chose a path that would transform India's political landscape and Morarji Desai's personal fate. On the night of 25 to 26 June 1975, emergency was declared. The Constitution's guarantees of fundamental rights were suspended. The opposition was decapitated in a single surgical operation. As the city slept, police moved with lists in their hands. Opposition leaders were dragged from their homes in darkness, bundled into jeeps, driven to undisclosed locations. At nearly 80, Morarji Desai was one of them. The man who had once enforced colonial law now felt the weight of independent India's handcuffs on his wrists. The irony was bitter. The same legal framework he had defended as essential to order was now being twisted by his rival to crush dissent. In Ahmednagar Fort, he listened as younger prisoners raged. They spoke of press censorship, of forced sterilization campaigns terrorizing the poor, of slums bulldozed in Delhi, of over 100,000 political opponents and ordinary citizens detained without trial. They cursed the old guard, the Congress leadership that had allowed one woman to hoard so much power. He did not rage publicly. It was not his way. Instead, he measured 22 months. That was how long the emergency would eventually last. When you are in your 20s, 22 months is an inconvenience. When you are almost 80, it is a lifetime. In that cell, a race began, between the will of a man who refused to bend even now and the clock of his own mortality. If he lost, the last serious challenger to Indira Gandhi's dominance would die behind walls, his story closing as a cautionary tale. Then, in January 1977, came the twist almost nobody foresaw. Confident that she had broken the opposition and reshaped public opinion, Indira Gandhi lifted the emergency and called for general elections. To many, it looked like the act of a leader certain of victory. To others, it was arrogance, the fatal overestimation of one's own indispensability. For Morarji Desai, still stiff-backed despite the prison months, it was something else entirely. It was a door half open with a timer attached. The scattered opposition parties, Socialist Jana Sangh, Congress, regional groups, suddenly had a chance, perhaps the last, to turn raw anger into a governing alternative. But they were a bag of scorpions, full of ideological contradictions and ancient grudges. Someone had to weld them into a single force, fast. In smoky rooms and crowded drawing rooms, the Janata Party was born, a hastily stitched-together alliance where former enemies sat. At the same table, united by one overriding goal, remove Indira Gandhi. Morarji Desai was in the center of those negotiations, his age now a paradoxical asset. He was too old to threaten the long-term ambitions of younger leaders. That made him, in theory, an acceptable compromise. But he was also stubborn, insistent that the new formation not become a chaotic bazaar of shortcuts and deal-making. Inside this newborn coalition, rivalries exploded immediately. Charan Singh, the blunt champion of North India's farmers, Jagjivan Ram, the Dalit leader who had dramatically walked out of Indira's cabinet at the last moment, younger firebrands who had risen in the JP movement and distrusted all old congressmen. Each had their own circle, their own claim to the future. And above them all, the shadow of Indira Gandhi, still prime minister, still wielding state resources, still a formidable campaigner. The election that followed was, in numbers, simple. The Janata wave swept North India. Indira Gandhi herself lost her seat in Raebareli. Her son Sanjay was defeated. Congress was humiliated. In feeling, though, it was more complicated. People who had once chanted for Nehru now stood in long lines to vote his daughter out. Villagers who barely understood the fine print of the Constitution somehow sensed that something had been violated in those 22 months and that a line had to be drawn. Morarji Desai, moving slowly through campaign stops, knew what was at stake for him personally. If Janata failed to secure a majority, if the coalition fractured, if Indira somehow clawed her way back, there would be no third act for him. At 81, there is no next time. The results gave Janata the numbers. But numbers on paper are not power. They are potential, waiting for someone to arrange them. In Delhi, the same drama that had haunted his life replayed itself, now in a different theater. Who would be prime minister? Charan Singh's supporters argued that the rural heartland had given Janata its muscle. Their leader should reap the reward. Jagjivan Ram's camp said the historic nature of a Dalit prime minister demanded to be seized. Some younger leaders whispered that, after the trauma of the emergency, India needed fresh blood, not an octogenarian. Once again, as in 1964 and 1966, Morarji Desai was the man with the most experience and the least certainty. All night, and then into the next day, bargaining raged. Threats of withdrawal were made, withdrawn, remade. Old insults were revived. The alliance that had seemed so solid against Indira suddenly looked like it might implode at the moment of victory. JP, frail but still morally commanding, intervened from his sickbed. Others in the movement argued that after 22 months in jail, after a lifetime of service, Morarji Desai had earned the right to lead. More coldly, they noted that only his stiff image of honesty could reassure a country jolted by authoritarianism that this new government would not be another personality cult. But there was another unspoken argument in the air: time. Charan Singh and Jagjivan Ram were younger. They could wait, or so the elders said. Morarji could not. If he was not made prime minister now, he would have no more chances. The deadline his body had set in Ahmednagar fort was still ticking. The compromise, when it finally emerged, was as fragile as glass. Morarji Desai would become prime minister. Charan Singh would be deputy prime minister and home minister. Jagjivan Ram would take defense. The Janata Party, held together by hope, fear, and exhaustion, would present a united face to the nation. On the day appointed, the old man from Bareilly, dressed with the same care he had shown as a young officer in British Bombay, starched khadi, neatly combed hair. No ostentatious jewelry, no dramatic flourishes. As the car carried him to Rashtrapati Bhavan, to the forecourt where the oath of office would be administered, he looked out at the wide ceremonial avenues of New Delhi, the city Lutyens had built for emperors, which had learned to pronounce Nehru's name, then Indira's. Now it would have to learn his. He stepped out. Cameras clicked. The sun beat down on the white sandstone. Ministers, diplomats, old colleagues, former jailmates watched from the chairs laid out in precise rows. Somewhere, far away in a modest bungalow, Indira Gandhi sat with a small group of loyalists, watching on television as the man she had once defeated, imprisoned, and dismissed climbed the steps she had just descended. The man who had once stood in a stark colonial corridor clutching a resignation letter now walked through another corridor, this one, lined with red carpet and guards presenting arms, toward a constitution he had helped write, a flag he had raised as a young revolutionary, or in a chair that had twice been denied him. At 81, with the weight of a lifetime of discipline on his shoulders and the cracks of age in his bones, Morarji Desai raised his hand to take the oath as Prime Minister of India. The clock for the first time seemed to pause, but it had not stopped. It had only reset, more ruthless than ever. For the man who had taken so long to reach the summit, the mountain of governing a wounded, fractious democracy was waiting, steep, a treacherous and unforgiving. Power, when it finally lands in his hands, does not feel like victory. It feels like a bomb with a faulty timer, placed in the lap of an 81-year-old man. On the first morning after the oath, Morarji Desai wakes in the Prime Minister's house and walks through rooms still heavy with the ghosts of the emergency. The curtains are the same, the carpets are the same. Somewhere, a clerk is retyping a letter on the same typewriter that once stamped out detention orders. Only the signature at the bottom has changed. He eats a simple breakfast, fruit, porridge, a glass of his much-discussed urine therapy taken in private, and then, before the sun has fully burned the mist off Raisina Hill, he is at his desk. No portraits of himself on the walls. No sycophantic slogans, just files. A stack of them thick enough to bury a man. The first file is symbolic. Orders to free political prisoners jailed during the emergency. In towns and villages across India, cell doors clang open. Men and women step blinking into the light after months, sometimes years, of not knowing if the country even remembered them. The second file, instructions to lift press censorship. In a single signature, the newspapers changed their tone. Headlines that had once praised discipline and stability now roar with pent-up fury. Cartoons show broken chains and gagged mouths ripped open. Reporters rush to print stories they had whispered in safe corners for 2 years. The third file, the repeal of MISA, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, that had allowed people to be detained without trial, the law that had put him in Ahmednagar fort. One by one, he takes a pen, reads carefully, and signs. In a world drunk on the drama of elections, the image is almost boring. An old man reading, frowning, signing. But this is how a democracy is repaired. Not with slogans, but with dry legal corrections. Still, the clock is ticking. He can feel it. He has fought 40 years to reach this desk. If he lives another 5, it will be a miracle. He has at best a single term to undo the damage of the emergency, to prove that a government without a single dominating personality can work, to show that discipline does not have to mean dictatorship. Outside, the expectations are dizzying. For millions, the Janata victory is not just a change of government, it is a moral event. The first non-Congress Prime Minister of India is supposed to be everything the last one was not. Humane, democratic, humble, honest. People imagine miracles. Inside the government, the reality is messier. The Janata Party is less a party than a crowded railway compartment at rush hour. Socialist firebrands sit next to former Jana Sangh activists shaped by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Old Congress, veterans like Morarji, share the table with Gandhian idealists who hate bureaucracy and bureaucrats who distrust idealists. Each group believes it defeated Indira Gandhi. Each group believes it deserves to shape the future. At the center of this chaos sits a man who hates chaos. Morarji Desai begins ruling India the way he once ran a district, then a state, by schedule, by file, by rulebook. His day starts at dawn with yoga and prayer, then an exact sequence of meetings, cabinet sessions, and briefings. Ministers who arrive late are scolded like schoolchildren. He reads every major file himself, drilling secretaries with questions, rejecting vague answers, demanding data. He bans alcohol in the Prime Minister's house. He cuts down the size of his security convoy. He refuses to let his relatives come anywhere near government contracts. When a businessman tries to flatter him with an expensive gift, he quietly has it deposited into the government's treasury. For a nation exhausted by arrogance and corruption, this is refreshing. Civil servants who had grown used to bending orders to please the high command now find themselves under the gaze of a man with an accountant's memory. If you promise to complete a project in 3 months, he will ask 3 months later for proof. If you fudge numbers, he will do the math in his head and catch you. He is determined that the abuses of the emergency will never be repeated. Within months, his government brings in the 43rd and then the 44th constitutional amendments. On paper, they look dry, technical changes to articles, clauses, provisos. In substance, they are locks on doors that had once been too easy to kick open. They make it harder for any future government to declare a national emergency on flimsy grounds. They ensure that certain fundamental rights to life and liberty cannot be suspended even under emergency. They clip the wings of a prime minister who might one day think themselves larger than the Constitution. It is, in a way, Morarji Desai's revenge on Indira Gandhi, not by jailing her, not by torturing her supporters, but by altering the legal architecture so that no one, not even a future Morarji Desai, can do what she did. Yet even as he strengthens institutions, the demand for a different kind of justice grows louder. Punish them. Shout the voices from the streets and the opposition benches. Expose what they did in the dark. In response, he sets up the Shah Commission of the Inquiry, headed by Justice J. C. Shah, a retired Chief Justice of India, to investigate the excesses of the emergency. Day after day, in a packed hall, the commission becomes a national theater of reckoning. Bureaucrats shuffle in, sweating under the camera lights, and admit how they signed detention orders without reading them. Police officers describe midnight raids. Victims tell stories that sound like something from a dictatorship, not the world's largest democracy. Sterilization camps where men were grabbed from buses, slums bulldozed because they did not fit the beautification plans of the Prime Minister's son. Names are named, files are produced. The Commission's reports paint a portrait of power out of control. The political pressure on Morarji mounts. Indira Gandhi sits in opposition, no longer Prime Minister but still a magnet for hatred and loyalty. Her face appears in every discussion of the emergency. Her name is on every angry tongue. Some of Morarji's colleagues, especially those who suffered most under her rule, want blood. Among them, his own Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister, Charan Singh. Charan Singh has built his career as the champion of North India's farmers, a man who loathes both urban elites and Indira Gandhi's legacy. He sees in her possible prosecution not just justice, but also political capital, a way to show that this government is not afraid to strike at the highest level. Morarji, too, believes that no one is above the law, but he also believes in process, evidence, ironclad cases. He will not sign off on a witch hunt. The tension between them begins as a crack, then widens. It is not just about Indira. It is about style, about values, about who really leads this fragile experiment in coalition rule. Charan Singh finds Morarji too slow, too preachy, too unwilling to compromise. Morarji finds Charan Singh impulsive, vindictive, too willing to treat the police and CBI as political weapons. In October 1977, the crack explodes. Acting on advice from within the government, the police arrest Indira Gandhi on charges related to corruption and misuse of power during the emergency. It happens in almost theatrical fashion. Cameras whir as she is taken into custody, sari neat, expression composed, refusing to seek bail, daring the state to humiliate her. To Morarji, it is meant to be the rule of law in action. To millions watching on evening news, it looks like revenge. The charges do not stick. The case collapses in court. Indira walks free, not as a disgraced autocrat, but as a wronged widow, a grandmother who has been dragged to jail by her enemies. Her supporters pour into the streets. Even some who had voted against her during the emergency begin to waver. They're hounding her. People murmur in markets and tea stalls, "This is too much." In trying to bury her, the Janata government has given her a second life. Inside Parliament, she becomes fiercer, shrewder. She sits on the opposition benches with a small but vocal group of loyal MPs, watching every move the government makes. When Morarji lectures on morality, she smiles faintly as if to say, "We'll see who history remembers." The rivalry that had once been about ideas, state versus restraint, populism versus austerity, now acquires the sharp scent of personal feud. And yet, paradoxically, Morarji cannot focus entirely on her, because the greater danger is no longer outside the government. It is inside his own bench. Janata's factions pull in different directions. The Jana Sangh members, who have waited years in the wilderness, want key ministries and recognition for their decades of struggle. Their ideological home, the RSS, remains controversial. To many socialists and secularists in Janata, it is too communal, too Hindu, nationalist. The issue of dual membership, whether Janata MPs can simultaneously remain part of the RSS, becomes a poisoned dagger on the table. Socialist leaders insist that there must be a clear separation, loyalty to Janata or loyalty to RSS, but not both. The Jana Sangh group fights back. Each side quietly cultivates its own press, its own networks, its own narratives of betrayal. Morarji tries to be the disciplinarian in the middle, demanding unity, but his gift, or his curse, is that he does not flatter. He tells men with large followings that they are wrong, in the same flat tone with which he once corrected a junior officer's math. Resentments harden. Charan Singh, nursing grievances of his own, begins to plot. He feels sidelined by what he sees as a coterie around Morarji, including men from the Jana Sangh and former Congress figures he mistrusts. His supporters whisper that the Prime Minister is too indulgent with the RSS faction, too intellectual, too detached from the real India of villages and grain markets. In 1978, as economic challenges bite harder, inflation, unemployment, drought in some regions, the public mood darkens. People who had expected Janata to be an instant cure for all wounds now complain that nothing has changed. Prices are still high. Corruption, though less ostentatious, has not vanished. The excitement of 1977 has become the impatience of 1978. In by-elections, Indira Gandhi's new faction, Congress I for her name, begins to win seats. One particularly symbolic victory comes when she contests from Chikmagalur in Karnataka in 1978 and wins. The same voters who once cheered as she was pushed out now cheer as she returns to Parliament. On the walls of poor neighborhoods, a new whisper appears in chalk. Bring her back. Inside the Prime Minister's house, the clock grows louder. Morarji is now 82. His doctors warn him to rest more, to delegate, to sleep. He ignores them. Rest to him is a form of moral laziness. He works late into the night, reading reports on River Valley projects, sugar production, state finances. He pushes for rural development schemes, for decentralization, for a return to Gandhian economics that prioritizes the village over the city. Some of his achievements are real but unglamorous: an attempt to reduce the centralized power of Delhi over states, a cleaner corporate environment, a less politicized civil service, a foreign policy that lowers the temperature with Pakistan and China without grandstanding. But in a world tuned to drama, they do not scream loud enough. What does scream is conflict. Charan Singh and his allies become open in their defiance. They accuse Morarji's circle of shielding Jana Sangh interests, of betraying farmers, of being soft on big business. In private, some even mutter that the old man is too concerned about his place in history to take necessary risks. Indira Gandhi, watching from across the aisle, does not need to lift a finger. Her enemies are slicing each other up for her. Then comes the final twist. In mid-1979, Charan Singh walks up to the line that had been drawn in every coalition negotiation, every tension-filled cabinet meeting, and this time he steps over it. He withdraws the support of his faction from the Janata government. The numbers in the Lok Sabha begin to wobble. Without Charan Singh's group, Morarji's majority is gone. There is talk of compromises, of last-minute truces. JP is no longer there to mediate. He has passed away, taking with him the unifying moral authority that once held these egos in check. Some advise Morarji to fight tooth and nail, to use every trick, every inducement to peel away MPs and cling to power. After all, they argue, Indira Gandhi once bent the system to breaking point to keep her chair. Why should he be more saintly than his rival? But that is precisely the point. He has spent his whole life insisting that ends do not justify means. That discipline without principle is just another word for fear. There is another factor, more personal, more brutal. He knows his age. If he manages to survive this crisis by horse trading and manipulation, what then? A few more months in office, perhaps a year, spent presiding over a government that everyone knows is rotten at the core, held together by bribes and threats? He has no illusions about achieving in one more year what he could not in two. So on 15th of July 1979, with the same rigid dignity with which he once resigned as Chief Minister of Bombay and later walked out of Indira, as cabinet, Morarji Desai goes to the Rashtrapati Bhavan. The drive this time feels different. The roads are the same broad imperial avenues. The guards still present arms. The domes still gleam in the hard Delhi sun. But in the back seat of the car sits a man who understands, perhaps more clearly than any other prime minister before him, what this journey really means. It is not just a change of job. It is the end of a race between a man and his own mortality. In the president's chamber, he submits his resignation. There is no weeping, no shouting, no melodrama, just a short formal statement. The Janata government, born out of the greatest challenge India's democracy had ever faced, dies not with a coup or a bang, but with the careful folding of a letter and the placing of a pen on a desk. Charan Singh, backed for the moment by Indira Gandhi's external support, will be invited to form the next government. Within weeks, that arrangement too will crumble when she withdraws her backing without warning, refusing him the confidence of Parliament. Elections will be called. The country will be asked again to choose. But for Morarji Desai, the contest has shifted. He walks out of Rashtrapati Bhavan not as a martyr, not as a clinging strongman dragged from office, but as an old soldier honorably. Discharged, his armor dented, his victories modest, his failures glaring. Outside the gates, cameras catch him for a moment. The lines on his face are deeper than they were 2 years before. The famous jaw is still set, but there is a flicker in his eyes, not of regret exactly, but of calculation, as if he is already adding up in some private ledger what he managed to do with the time he was finally given. He knows what is coming. Indira Gandhi is regrouping. Her Congress, stronger with every by-election. The sympathy she wrung from that October arrest has not faded. In fields and factories, the memory of the emergency has blurred into a distant discomfort, while the immediate frustrations of unemployment and rising prices glow bright. He cannot stop her with another election campaign. He has neither the energy nor the machinery. Janata is splintered beyond repair. For the first time since he was a young man, Morarji Desai is about to become something he has never really been, a citizen without office, a politician without a future job to aim at. Yet the clock that haunted him in Ahmednagar Fort, that ticked so loudly when he took the oath in 1977, has not stopped merely because he has stepped down. If anything, it is louder now, echoing in the quiet of rooms without red beacons and ringing telephones, in the silence he will have to face when the country he tried to discipline chooses, of its own free will, to bring back the very leader he helped to drive out. His time in power is over. The question that remains is more unforgiving than any budget he ever balanced. When history closes the file on Morarji Desai, what will be written in the margin? Success, failure, or something harder to name? On the night the country votes him out of relevance, the city outside his window explodes in firecrackers. Not for him. For the return of the rival he thought history had already judged. In a small, dimly lit room in Bombay, far from the blazing arc lamps of Delhi, 83-year-old Morarji Desai sits ramrod straight in an ordinary wooden chair and listens to the crackle of celebration. On the radio, the announcer's voice is breathless. Congress I surges ahead. Indira Gandhi set to become prime minister again. The same name. The same woman whose emergency he dismantled, whose power he clipped with constitutional amendments, whose arrest backfired and turned her into a martyr. Now she is sweeping back to office on a wave of votes from the same people who once shouted, "Down with dictatorship." The contrast could not be starker. Only 2 years ago, he had walked into the Prime Minister's residence as the man who saved Indian democracy from her excesses. Tonight, he is an old man in a plain kurta, his only security a single constable at the gate, his only audience a ticking clock and the scratch of his own fountain pen. Somewhere in Delhi, they are rehanging her picture where his once briefly stood. The radio drones on about seat tallies, alliances, stable government. He switches it off with a sharp, almost offended movement. For a long moment, there is silence. Then, from the building next door, the burst of a song, a film melody celebrating victory, hope, a new dawn. He has lived long enough to know that new dawns are rarely new. He is not surprised that Janata has collapsed. He watched the fissures open from the inside, the quarrels over dual membership, the egos, the bitter defection of Charan Singh, but the speed of the reversal still stings. In 1977, Indira lost her own seat. In 1980, she not only wins, she returns to the same office as if those 30 months of alternative rule were a brief, embarrassing intermission. It feels, for one hard second, as if his entire struggle, the prison years, the hunger strike, the constitutional safeguards, has been reduced to a footnote. He could retire in bitterness. He does not. Instead, he sets himself an even more impossible deadline. Before his failing body finally gives up, he will try to fix not the government. That chance is gone, but the story of what power in India should look like. The story of what went wrong when one person was allowed to grow larger than the Constitution. And the story of what he, Morarji Desai, actually stood for, beyond the caricature of the stern old man who drank his own urine and scolded ministers like misbehaving children. Each morning, long before sunrise, a dim yellow light appears in his window. At 4:30, as he did in his days as a clerk, as a collector, as a chief minister, as a prime minister, he wakes, yoga, prayer, a glass of urine therapy, the habit that has made him a national oddity and, he insists, kept him alive. Then he sits at a desk scarred with ink stains and begins to write letters, speeches, notes for his memoirs. The handwriting is neat, almost old-fashioned, each letter formed with care. He has no keyboard, no tape recorder. Just pen and paper and the stubborn belief that if he writes clearly enough, if he explains his reasoning thoroughly enough, the public, or if not the public, then at least history, will understand him. Time is the enemy now, more than Indira Gandhi, more than Congress, more than any foreign power. His doctors murmur about his heart, about his prostate, about the inevitable decline of organs that have worked without pause for 8 decades. Friends and allies urge him to rest. Rest, that word he has always half associated with moral decay, he ignores them. When reporters climb the stairs to his modest flat, they find him sitting erect on a straight-back chair, never reclining, never slouching, eyes bright behind thick glasses. He lectures them the way he once lectured junior officers. The trouble with this country, he says, is that people prefer slogans to discipline. They prefer to be charmed rather than governed. The subtext is unmistakable. His competitor has that charm in abundance. He never did. As Indira Gandhi settles into her second innings as prime minister, he becomes her most relentless elderly shadow. From Bombay, he fires off criticism after criticism of what he calls her authoritarian streak disguised as concern for the poor, of her continuation of the nuclear program he had tried to restrain, of her tendency, as he sees it, to centralize power in the prime minister's office once again. He cannot oppose her with numbers in parliament anymore, but he can oppose her with memory. Remember the emergency, he tells gatherings in dusty town halls and cramped Bombay auditoriums. Do not fall asleep just because the jail doors are no longer visible. The response is muted. People listen respectfully. Some applaud. Many drift away, pulled by more immediate problems. The price of kerosene, bus fares, floods. Democracy restored is not as dramatic as democracy attacked. An autocrat reborn as an elected leader is easier to forgive than an old man reminding you of your own cowardice in 1975. Still, he will not stop. There is one consolation, harsh and strange. His great competitor, the woman whose presence has defined his last decade, will not outlast him. On 31st October 1984, when shots echo through Indira Gandhi's garden, when her blood splashes the gravel path of her official residence, when the sirens cut through Delhi traffic, Morarji Desai is at home in Bombay listening to the news on the radio again. This time there are no firecrackers, only stunned voices, only the rising, terrifying crackle of something else. Mobs forming, rumors spreading, Sikh families barricading their doors as revenge riots begin. He hears the announcer choke on the words, "Prime Minister Indira Gandhi is dead." They had competed for so long that imagining India without her had become almost impossible. For a second, he is simply a stunned citizen, not a rival. Then the old political mind begins to work. He knows what this means. Congress will use the wave of sympathy. Another Gandhi, Rajiv, the pilot's son who once seemed uninterested in politics, will be pushed forward as the next savior. The family name, the dynasty he has always resented as un-Gandhian, will continue. He also knows something else, more uncomfortable. He has outlived her. The woman who jailed him, whom he helped to defeat, who then came back and erased his term with a single election, will be carried to her funeral pyre before him. He, the man everyone keeps writing political obituaries for, is still here, spine as straight as ever, watching her funeral on a flickering television screen. The rivalry does not end with her. It mutates. Now the opponent is less a person than a machine. The Congress system, the idea that only a strong, charismatic center, preferably with the Gandhi surname, can hold India together. Against that, he offers a stubborn, increasingly lonely counter-idea that institutions matter more than individuals, that discipline is more important than drama. Rajiv Gandhi comes to power on a tidal wave of grief, modernity, and promises of clean governance. Young, handsome, talking of computers and Panchayati Raj, he seems the very opposite of the austere, sermonizing octogenarian in Bombay, and for a while the country is dazzled. Morarji watches, unimpressed. He has seen youthful promise before, in Nehru, in Indira. He has seen how quickly idealism can twist into entitlement. So when the Bofors scandal erupts, Swedish guns, middlemen, whispered commissions filling secret accounts, he seizes it like a man who has been waiting all his life for this precise vindication. At 90, he drags his tired body onto campaign stages again. Under harsh sun on creaking platforms, his voice, thinner now but still sharp, cuts through loudspeakers. You cannot have clean government with dirty money. You cannot fight corruption with corrupt men. He backs VP Singh, the ex-Congress finance minister who has broken with Rajiv over Bofors, as the new spear aimed at the Congress fortress. It is a strange late alliance, a rigid Gandhian elder blessing a younger, more flexible politician who has made his name as an anti-corruption crusader. But in Morarji's mind, the line is clear. This is still the same war, his war against the culture of impunity he associates with Congress rule. When Rajiv Gandhi finally loses in 1989, when V.P. Singh becomes prime minister at the head of a fragile coalition, Morarji allows himself a brief satisfaction. Not joy, he does not do joy, but a penciled tick in his internal ledger. Another Gandhi defeated, another reminder that the dynasty is not invincible. But even in his victories, the ground under his feet is shifting. There is a new competitor in the ring now, one he has helped inadvertently to legitimize. Back in 1980, when the Janata Party imploded over the dual membership issue, when former Jana Sangh members walking out of Janata formed a new party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, they came to him, the elder statesman, for a kind of moral certificate. He gave it. He admired their organizational discipline, their personal austerity, their years of sacrifice in opposition. He liked their rhetoric against corruption, against dynastic politics. When others called them dangerous Hindu communalists, he brushed it aside as exaggeration. They are patriots, he would say. Do not doubt their intentions, only debate their methods. So, in the late 1980s, as the BJP begins to rise on a wave of Hindu mobilization around the Ram Janmabhoomi movement in Ayodhya, he watches with growing unease. The party he once praised for discipline is filling streets with processions, slogans, saffron flags. The speeches mix calls for honesty with demands to tear down a centuries-old mosque. The crowds chant Mandir Wahin Banayenge. We will build the temple there. As if national integrity can be hammered out of bricks and mythology, he is torn. On one side, the old enemy, Congress, with its record of emergency, corruption, dynasty. On the other, his one-time protégés playing with religious fire in a country divided along fragile lines. His health is failing now. He shuffles more than strides. His voice trembles sometimes when he speaks. But when asked, he still tries to impose moral order on chaos. He rebukes the BJP in letters and interviews, warning against mixing religion with state. In private conversations, he says, Hindus do not need to prove they are Hindus by shouting, "True faith is quiet." But the wind has shifted. The television screens now belong to men who thrive on shouting. December 1992. Morarji Desai, 96 years old, sits propped up on pillows, watching the live broadcast from Ayodhya. Thousands of car sevaks milling around the disputed Babri Masjid. Politicians making half-hearted promises to the Supreme Court that nothing will happen. Then the first cracks, the first stones, the first jubilant cries as the dome begins to crumble. On the grainy screen, a 16th-century mosque collapses in dust and triumphal chants. This is not the discipline he dreamed of. This is not the India he tried to keep out of the jaws of emergency. For a long time after the broadcast, he says nothing. The room is quiet except for the small sounds of an old body. The careful breath, the rustle of a blanket moved an inch. Then he turns to a visitor and asks, in a voice scraped of all rhetoric, "Tell me, is this also democracy? Or is it another kind of lawlessness wearing different colors?" There is no simple answer. His own record, spotless in some lights, is stained in others. In the early 1990s, as scholars pore through declassified American documents, an accusation surfaces in the public domain that cuts him deeply. A former CIA officer suggests that years earlier, when Morarji was prime minister, he tipped off Pakistan's military ruler Zia-ul-Haq about covert Indian operations in that country. To some, it sounds like an almost unbelievable betrayal. How could a man so fiercely patriotic, who went to jail under the British, who bled for India's freedom, have endangered his own intelligence? Networks to curry favor with Pakistan? His supporters dismiss the charge as Cold War disinformation. His critics say it fits his almost naive commitment to transparency, that he simply hated the idea of secret operations so much he could not keep his mouth shut. The controversy flares brighter in 1990, when Pakistan awards him the Nishan-e-Pakistan, its highest civilian honor, for his efforts to improve relations between the two countries. The image is jarring. An Indian prime minister who never received the Bharat Ratna from his own nation, now smiling faintly as a Pakistani delegation pins their highest decoration to his chest. Some call him a peacemaker. Others, in angry newspaper columns and whispered conversations, use harsher words: fool, traitor, idealist blind to threat. For Morarji, the medal is a vindication of his long-held belief that neighbors must talk, not glare. That nuclear bombs, which he always opposed, even when it made him unpopular at home, are not symbols of strength, but of failure to negotiate. He has lived to see himself turned into a symbol, then a caricature, then a question mark. By 1994, the body that once withstood hunger strikes and prison diets betrays him. A fall, a fracture, bed rest. For a man who has never liked beds except at night, who even as prime minister preferred to sit bolt upright in hard chairs, this is the cruelest sentence. He now conducts his life from a horizontal position, spine aligned not by will but by pillows. Still, the routine persists as much as it can. Even lying down, he insists on proper clothes during the day, not nightwear. Visitors, former colleagues, young politicians seeking blessings, journalists looking for one last quote, are received with the same old formality. He listens, asks pointed questions, offers blunt advice. Do not chase popularity, he tells a brash young leader one afternoon. Chase correctness. Popularity will die with the season. Correctness will haunt you if you ignore it. Outside his window, Bombay is changing into Mumbai. Skyscrapers creep upward. Liberalization reshapes the economy he once tried to keep tethered to Gandhian simplicity. Color televisions flicker in slums. The word discipline has migrated from his speeches into self-help books and corporate training programs. On 10th of April 1995, after nearly a century of refusing to bend, his body finally does what his will never did. At 99 years old, the last surviving major figure of the pre-independence generation of Indian politics, older than Nehru, older than Patel, older even than Jinnah, dies in the city where he first wore a clerk's pen behind his ear. He dies having outlived almost every rival he ever had. Indira Gandhi, Charan Singh, Jayaprakash Narayan, Rajiv Gandhi. Even Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, who falls from the sky in a mysterious plane crash, is long gone by the time Morarji's heart stops. He wins, in the end, the only competition no one thinks about until it's too late, the race against time itself. What he does not win, at least not clearly, is the contest over memory. Ask 10 Indians on the street about Morarji Desai, and you will hear, more often than not, a single detail first. Wasn't he the prime minister who drank his own urine? She. The more important files on his life, the man who refused to let a prime minister become bigger than the Constitution, who undid press censorship with one signature, who tried to bury the possibility of another emergency under layers of legal locks, sit dusty in the public mind. His rivalry with Indira Gandhi has been simplified into a cartoon. Her charisma versus his austerity, her boldness versus his nagging morality. In that cartoon, she looms larger. She has the airport, the schemes, the mythology. He has at best a chapter in a textbook. And yet, look closely at the India that exists after him. Every time a prime minister hesitates to declare an emergency, knowing the law no longer bends so easily, every time a police officer reads a detention order twice because arbitrary arrest is now harder to justify, every time journalists, however embattled, still manage to shout into the public square without prior censorship, in those invisible acts his hand is still on the page. In the end, his legacy is not a monument you can photograph. It is an absence. The absence of another declared emergency, despite temptations. The absence of absolute power dressed up as patriotism, unchecked by rules. The absence of his name in the list of leaders who broke the Constitution to stay in office. He lost elections, he lost popularity contests. He lost the simple, brutal competition with Indira Gandhi for the love of the masses. But in a quieter, slower struggle, the struggle over what kind of state India would be allowed to become, he placed obstacles in the path of every future authoritarian, including himself. Perhaps that is why, if you could open the file, history keeps on Morarji Desai, the note in the margin would not be a clear success or failure. It might be something stranger, harder, more valuable, a small, precise word that he, the lifelong accountant of public life, might have approved of. Constraint.